nobody knows exactly where Emmaus was. This much we know from Luke's gospel. It was about 7 miles from Jerusalem. By modern standards, that's not much of a commute, but for people who travel on foot, it must have seemed a safe distance from the heartbreak and chaos of Holy Week. And nobody knows this for sure either, but it's a pretty good bet that Emmaus was home, at least for one of the 2 disciples in this story. My guess is it was Cleophas who had a house in Emmaus. I figure he was going home, disgusted, heartbroken, just fed up. I think Cleophas had it up to here with Jerusalem and everybody in it. He'd seen his fellow Jews pushed around by Roman soldiers, seen their dignity insulted every day. He'd watched Jesus, the man he admired more than anyone else he'd ever met, strung up on a cross like a rag doll. He watched the religious leaders behave like jealous children, and he'd seen grown men who'd promised to follow Jesus to the very end scatter at the first sign of trouble. All that happened just outside the walls of Jerusalem, and within the walls of Jerusalem, I think Cleophas is just glad to get away from that place. And if I may say such a thing from the pulpit, I think Cleophas had it up to here with God, too. Like a good religious Jew, Cleophas had been raised to put his trust in God. God will deliver you from the hand of the enemy. God will restore the futures of Israel. God will never let you go. That's what he had been taught to believe. And when Jesus came along, Cleophas saw all of those promises coming true. To hear Jesus tell it, the kingdom of God was in the air like the smell of rain after a long drought. It was coming, all but arrived. And when he saw those former lepers walking around with skin like little babies, when he saw former cripples dancing about on 2 strong legs, he could believe it was so as well. Jesus had helped Cleophas to see everything with new eyes. But now Jesus was dead, flogged, mocked, pierced, dead. God had him going there for a while, but Cleophas had gotten God's cruel joke. Things were never going to change. Life would always be this way. A long, cruel string of broken promises that leads to the grave. And now, Cleophas and his friend were on their way out of that city of despair, on the road to Emmaus, away from Jerusalem, away from the broken promises, away from the smirking soldiers and the broken body that was proof positive that God was too weak to keep God's promises or just didn't care. They were going to home to Emmaus, or they could close the door and give up. I have been on that road myself. Perhaps you have too. I've trusted people to live up to their promises and then watched them behave as though they had never made them. I visited in the homes of people who asked to present their children for baptism. I've gone over the vows with them, talked about the radical commitment that they would be making if they were to bring their children to the waters of this font. Don't do this if you don't mean it, I said. Don't go through the motions. This is not a piece of liturgical theater. Oh, no, they said. Oh, we mean it. But after a few months, I see them less and less frequently. Busy, I suppose, pressure of work, lots of things to do. I occasionally see their children, some of them teenagers, some of them in their 20s by now. I wonder, do they even know that they're baptized? Has anybody told them lately that they belong to God? But that's not the whole picture. I made a promise too. I said I'd be their pastor. I said the church would follow through. I said we'd keep up. I'd have lunch every now and then. I'd phone them on their birthdays. I seldom did. How can I blame other people for not keeping their promises if I don't keep my own? Maybe that bothered Cleopas too. Maybe he was thinking that he might have stuck with Jesus a little longer, at least as long as the women. Maybe it wasn't just God that Cleopas was mad at. Maybe he was mad at himself too. Maybe it was more than the sight of Jesus hanging on that cross that Cleopas wanted to get out of his head. Maybe it was the look of his own face in the mirror. There are no mirrors in Emmaus. At Emmaus, he could get away. I can hear him saying to his friend, let's not go back there again. Let's never go back to Jerusalem. Let's stay in Emmaus. In Emmaus, we can forget. Cleopas and his friend were so lost in conversation that they didn't even notice that a stranger had been walking alongside them for some time. What are you discussing amongst yourselves as you walk alone? The stranger asks. What, you can't guess? We're talking about Jesus, who was a mighty prophet, or so we thought. Our religious leaders sold him out and the Romans crucified him. We thought he was the one, the Redeemer. Shows you what chumps we are. Not only that, some women in our group came back from the tomb with some cock and bull story about angels and a vision that said that he was alive. The stranger said he was not surprised to hear all of this. It's all in the scriptures, he said. Let's review. We'll start with Moses. What he said about the Messiah and how he was to suffer and die in order for God's full glory to be made known, that came as news to Cleopas. Hadn't occurred to him that God's glory could be revealed in weakness, or that God could keep God's promises through a cross. It didn't make sense, but he did want to hear more. By then, they were at the door of his house. Come in, he told the stranger. Stay with us. The day's just about over. It's not safe after dark. Spend the night. For some reason, it was the stranger who played the role of host at dinner. He took the bread. He said the traditional prayer. He broke the bread, and as Cleopas had done 1,000 times, he gave it to them. And at that moment, Cleopas wasn't in that house in Emmaus anymore. He was on a hillside in Galilee again, collecting baskets of leftover bread. It had looked as though the crowd, thousands of them, would all go home empty, but the disciples came up with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fishes, and Jesus took the bread, blessed it, broke it, gave it to them. The crowd had eaten their fill, and it takes 12 baskets to collect all the leftovers. Now Cleopas is at the seashore. His disciples are having an impromptu barbecue picnic. Cleopas can smell this fish smoking on the fire. Someone's told a joke. Jesus is laughing. He throws his head back, and the tears of hilarity roll down his cheeks. Now Cleopas is in the house of a Pharisee. A woman has come in while Jesus is at the table. She lets down her hair. She breaks the seal on a jar of costly perfume. She's weeping. Her tears fall upon Jesus' feet. She wipes the tears with her hair and anoints his feet with that perfume. The smell of that perfume fills the whole room. Cleopas is looking at the bread in the stranger's hand, only it's not a stranger. It's Jesus. It's him. He is alive. He's very much alive. As sure as those 12 baskets are full on the hillside, as sure as the wood smoke from that fire on the beach, as sure as that pungent aroma of that costly perfume, as sure as the memory of all those meals they shared together, Jesus is alive, as sure as the bread blessed and broken and given. The broken promises aren't important now. What matters is the bread that has been broken. And it wasn't God who broke the promises. God kept God's promises. It's you and I who have broken ours. I can't say that doesn't matter. Broken promises always hurt, but more important than the promises we broke are the promises that God keeps. It's all there in the breaking of the bread. Cleopas sees that now. It's not as though it's as though his eyes have been opened. He knows that the women were right and he had disbelieved them. I can't tell you why he knows. I can tell you how he knows. He knows in the breaking of the bread. Now Cleopas is on the road again, running not away from Jerusalem, but toward Jerusalem, toward those promises he broke, toward those women whom he disbelieved, toward the place where God has called him. For Jesus is alive not only in Emmaus. Jesus is alive in Jerusalem. He's alive in the promises God has made and kept. He's alive to us as we make new promises. He's alive right now in the meal where he is host. He is alive in the breaking of the bread. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.